Hey guys! Tonight we vanish into the shadows of a city that smells like burning fat and betrayal because we're stepping into the shoes of a 13th century assassin. Not the sleek fantasy type. No eagle dives. No elegant robes stitched with magic thread. This is real. It's brutal. It's unpaid if you're lucky, and fatal if you're not. You're poor, half-starved, likely sick with something you can't name, and still, someone out there expects you to kill a man tonight like it's just another Wednesday. Your tools? A dull dagger, an aching gut, and maybe if the priest turns a blind eye absolution after the fact. This isn't honor, this is survival. Forget what you think you know about the Middle Ages. No chivalry here. No honor codes with polished knights. Assassins were often the disposable ends of political grudges used, betrayed, replaced. And tonight, you are one of them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up on a rotting mattress, soaked with something that might be your sweat, or might be the rat piss from the ceiling beams. Either way, it's cold. You slept in your boots again. Not because you're lazy, but because you don't trust your surroundings. This isn't your bed. It's a room you rented under a fake name, with half a coin and the other half promised tomorrow, which you might not live to see. You feel the ache first. Right side of your ribs where the bruise still blossoms from yesterday's scuffle. You remember it like a dream. A city guard shoulder, checking you too hard, you responding too slow. His laugh. Your silence. You're lucky he didn't ask what was under your cloak. But that was yesterday. Today, you kill a man. The room smells of boiled onions and mildew. The walls are cracked plaster. The window is a shutter with no latch. Through its gap you see the early light bleeding over terracotta roofs. Bells will ring soon. You have until the evening. You don't get another chance. You sit up, check the bundle under your mattress. Everything's there. A curved blade, smuggled from the southern ports. A vial of powdered ash that burns the eyes if thrown. And a wax-sealed letterproof of the contract, though no name is signed. That's how these things go. One mark, two witnesses, and your silence. You wash your face with stale wine from last night. It stings. Better than water, which smells like fish and sewage. You check your boots. Inside the right one is the thin garrote wire, still taut. You wrap it around your wrist like a bracelet. The dagger you strap under your left forearm, blade downward, handle ready. You'll be searched, but not well. They don't search for someone like you. Not unless you give them a reason. Your first stop is the chapel. Not for prayer, not really. But there's a coin you need to slide into the hands of a certain blind priest who knows how to whisper when to strike. You slip through the alleyways, avoiding main roads. Dogs bark. A merchant curses at a boy for dropping a crate of olives. Above, women hang laundry from lines strung like webs between buildings. The city is alive and rotting, breathing and choking at once. You reach the chapel just as the bells ring tierce mid-morning. Inside, the air is thick with incense, but not enough to mask the smell of damp stone and old gilt. You kneel at the wrong altar, first on purpose. A penance. Then you move to the second, the one dedicated to Saint Lucia, patron of the blind. The priest is already there, cloaked in grey, his cataract-clouded eyes staring into nothing. He doesn't speak until you place the coin in the basin. "You're late," he whispers. "I'm early," you answer. The man arrives before dusk. One guard, one dog. Walks the outer courtyard at the edge of the wool guild. You nod. That's the time. That's the place. You've never met the target. You know only this. He sells information to rival families and keeps his records written in wax. The letter said the words, "Record fire." You're not just to kill him, you're to destroy his entire archive. That complicates things, but not as much as the dog. Back in the street, you eat a bruised apple and half a meat pie you bought from a stall, run by a man whose hands shake worse than yours. The meat is questionable. You swallow anyway. Hunger is the real killer. You check in with your contact at the brothel near the smithy. The madam knows your face. She doesn't like it. She gives you a key to the upstairs storage, says it's already unlocked. No payment needed, already handled. You don't ask who. Inside, you find a heavy hooded, cloaked in soot, to blend with the rooftop sand a flask of lamp oil. That's for the wax records. You also find a note tucked under the collar. No witnesses. That includes the dog. The dog. You hate that part. Midday now. You rest in the shade near the city fountain, pretending to listen to a juggler. Children laugh. A woman screams at her husband. A thief is chased down an alley by two guards in chainmail, too heavy for this heat. You watch all of it through narrowed eyes. This is the city you protect, in a way, or break. Depends on who's paying. By dusk, you're perched on a rooftop, cloak drawn tight, watching the courtyard below. The man is there, bald, round-faced, dressed too well for someone so dirty. He walks with a limp. His guard is distracted. The dog, lean and black, sniffing at the grass. You count your breaths. You wait for the bell to ring vespers. When it does, it masks your landing soft boots on tiled roof, then stone, then shadow. You move like blood through a vein. Closer now, you feel the ache in your ribs again. You unsling the garrote, fingers trembling. The guard sees you too late. You're behind him before he can speak. The wire bites. He drops. The dog snarls. You don't want this part. It lunges. You're faster. It dies with a sound you'll hear in your sleep for weeks. You whisper a sorry, like it helps. Then it's just the man. He runs. You follow. He slips on the stone path. You catch him. The dagger slides in clean, under the ribs. You twist. You pull back. He chokes. His eyes never meet yours. The wax records burn fast. The smell is terrible. You leave before the guards arrive. Blend into the crowd of beggars near the wine cellar. Your hands are shaking. Blood dries under your nails. You're not a hero. You're a tool. But you lived. And tomorrow, maybe they'll send another letter. Maybe they won't. Either way, you don't sleep easy. You don't dream. You just wait for morning. Your feet hit the cobblestone in silence, but inside your skull, the thrum of the kill still echoes, heart pounding from memory, not motion. The dagger is clean, but your soul isn't. You wrap it in cloth anyway, slide it into your belt pouch, and breathe in the city like it owes you something. It doesn't. You have hours before nightfall. That's both a blessing and a curse. Time means planning, but also space for doubt to creep in. You need to know what you're walking into tonight. What doors are open? What ones are guarded? Where the moonlight lands when it spills across the rooftops like molten silverand which alley rats to bribe so they don't squeal for bread when you pass overhead. You start with the old woman near the tanner's stall. She sits cross-legged on a pile of discarded leather, eyes nearly milk white from cataracts, but she sees more than most. She doesn't beg. She just knows. Everyone pays her in gossip, and she turns that gossip into gold for the right ears. You drop a silver shaving clipped from a coin you filed down last week into her palm. She doesn't look at it. Woolgild's outer yard is cursed, she mutters, voice like parchment crackling in flame. Dog died there last week. Whole family's luck gone sour. Rats won't even nest. You nod. It's her way of telling you the place is quiet. No civilians, no witnesses, no excuses. You drift through the market next, dodging robed monks and bread sellers who shout louder than priests at festival. Every scent clings to your cloak: smoked fish, spiced wine, manure. It's a soup of humanity, here a clashing, rotting, pulsing. Near the olive press, you spot your second contact, a toothless man they call Biter. Why? You're not sure, but the name fits. He gnaws at his fingernails constantly, as if they're the only meat he can afford. He doesn't speak. You hand him a wax seal marked with a symbol you were told to never describe out loud. He nods and slips you a sliver of parchment. On it, a rough sketch of the building's layout. Side, door, guard schedule, firewood stack near the ledgers. Someone's been planning this longer than you've known the job existed. You pass the cathedral on your way out. You're not supposed to stop. You do anyway. There's a boy selling candles at the gate, barefoot and loud. His eyes find yours for a heartbeat too long. You turn before he can speak. You don't need to know his story. You can already guess how it ends. Back in the alley, near the glassblower's shop, you lean against the wall and close your eyes for a breath that feels like drowning. The city beats like a living thing. Somewhere, someone is shouting about taxes. Somewhere else, a couple moans through a paper-thin wall. You smell garlic and yeast, and further off, the sharp sting of forge smoke. You press your fingers to your chest and count your heartbeats. Still fast, too fast. You haven't eaten enough. You haven't slept enough. You are, by all accounts, unfit to do what you're about to do. But that doesn't matter. No one waits for you to feel ready. You head for the brothel next, not for pleasure. That's long gone. You're there for the third contact. She's tall, with a nose that's been broken and reset 3 times, and she talks in riddles. You only ever catch half the meaning, and you're fairly certain that's by design. Storm's coming, she says, drying her hands on a blood-stained cloth. The kind that doesn't need clouds. You raise an eyebrow. She smirks. Your target's got more friends than you were told. One upstairs, pretending to be drunk. One near the stables, real drunk. You'll need a distraction. You nod. That's her cue. She hands you a pouch of dried crushed berries red as blood, bitter as sin. You sprinkle them into the drink of the stable guard, and by the time the moon's up, he'll be shitting through both ends. The other one upstairs? That's still a problem. You circle back to the slums for your last errand. The boy. Small, maybe 9. You call him Crow because he once stole a crow's egg from a nest 5 stories up and lived to brag about it. He's fast, invisible, and owes you a favour. I need noise, you say. Lots of it. About the time the watch changes. He nods, grinning with a chipped tooth. Firecrackers? Too loud. Pots and pans. Maybe a dead goat if you've got one. He laughs. I always got a goat. That's one less thing to worry about. You return to the room around mid-afternoon. It's worse than before. The mould has crept higher on the wall, and someone's scrawled a message in the grime on your door. Just one word. Soon. You can't tell if it's meant for you or left by someone else with worse luck. Either way, you don't like it. You sharpen your blade with slow strokes. Every rasp of steel on stone is a promise, not to yourself, not to your client, to the city. that you'll do what needs doing, whether or not anyone thanks you. By the time twilight spills gold and rose across the sky, you're perched again higher this time, 3 buildings over. The dog is gone. The guard's shadow stretches long and lazy. The drunk upstairs is pacing now. You count each step. You whisper his name like a curse. Below, the mark is reading. A ledger, probably. He doesn't know it's his last chapter. You wonder what he did. Lied? Betrayed? Sold someone he shouldn't? You hope it was something vile. It makes the job easier. Crow starts his racket on cue pots clanging, children shouting, a goat bleating like it's being murdered. It might be. Chaos erupts near the stables. The outer guard runs. The man upstairs sticks his head out to yell. That's all you need. You move. 1 breath, 1 leap, 1 landing like silk on stone. You're in. Again. But this time, something's off. A voice. Low. Not his. Not the guard's. A whisper from the shadows. Someone else is here. And you realize too late you're not the only one sent tonight. You freeze. That voice, low, urgent, breathless, wasn't part of the plan, and it wasn't meant for you. It came from within the building, someone whispering fast, maybe issuing a warning, not to your mark. No, to someone else already in position. Another blade. Another contract. Maybe for the same man. Maybe for you. You've stepped into a job already in motion. The room below you flickers with lamplight, distorted through warped glass panes. You can just make out your target, a rotund man hunched over his ledger, a ribbon of hair glued to his scalp with sweat. He's mouthing words as he writes, completely unaware that death is pooling around him like fog. You're pressed against the outer stone wall now, 1 floor above. A drainpipe creaks under your boot as you shift weight. Your pulse has slowed not from calm, but focus. Every breath is metered, every blink delayed. Inside, there's movement. A second shadow, leaner, faster. Someone else crept in through the servant's entrance. No noise, no panic. This isn't a thief. This is a professional. Someone like you. You don't know if they're competition or sabotage. Doesn't matter. The room is no longer a quiet stage for a clean kill. It's a trapper-tangle of intentions that weren't yours. You were told 1 dog, 1 guard, 1 man. No one said anything about rivals. You curse under your breath and drop silently onto the adjoining balcony. You press a loop of the garrote between your fingers. You might need it soon. Inside the office, the second assassin hesitates. You see it. A pause. Just a moment, where their weight shifts wrong. Your target senses something. He starts to turn in his chair. The stranger lunges. It's messy. The blade doesn't land right. Instead of a clean stab, it drags across the chest, painful, shallow, panic-inducing. Your mark screams. That's when you move. Through the side window, glass shatters as you crash through, in a flurry of motion and cloak. You don't stop to think. The second assassin wheels, around eyes wild, face smeared with ash. Female, maybe 20, maybe 40. You can't tell. Her blade is curved like yours. You both lunge. Steel clangs, slips, sings. She's better than most. You're faster. Your foot hooks hers, and you drive her shoulder into the desk. She snarls and swings upward. You dodge, barely. The lamp crashes to the ground, flames licking the edge of the ledger stack. The mark is crawling, bleeding, shrieking now. No one's come yet. Either the guards are drunk, bribed, or both. The woman tries again. You kick her in the ribs, and she grunts. You feel bone shift under your boot. She'll remember that. if she lives. But then she spits something strange. Not yours. It stops you cold. Not yours? This job wasn't for you. You turn toward the mark. He's coughing blood, eyes frantic. His hand is reaching for something under the desk. You see the hilt of a knife just as it clears leather. He lunges toward the woman. She doesn't hesitate. Her blade slits his throat. It's fast, messy, again, but final. The room is now filling with smoke. The ledger's caught. You smell burning wax and parchment. Pages curl and blacken in the heat. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. You glare at her. She meets your eyes and shrugs. I was here first. Then why did you screw it up? She laughs sharp, bitter. Because I thought you were the backup. Footsteps now, loud ones, guards. Finally. No time for blame, no time for questions. You grab her by the wrist and pull. She hesitates just long enough to make you regret it, but she follows. You both tumble through the hall, smoke and flame chasing your heels. Down the servants' stairwell, over a table, through a back door that's chained but not locked. You kick it open. You're in the alley now, gasping. She wrenches free and melts into shadow. You don't follow. The next few hours are a blur. You change your cloak, your walk, your posture. You duck into the bathhouse to wash the blood off your hands and face. A merchant stares too long. You stare back until he turns away. At the tavern, you buy a cup of piss-warm wine and sip it with shaking hands. No one sits near you. You reek of smoke and adrenaline. You replay it in your mind. The mark, the blade, the whisper, her words. Not yours. So who did she work for? Same family? Rival house? Maybe you were both sent to kill him insurance. Or maybe one of you was bait. You don't sleep that night. You sit on the edge of your bed, dagger in hand, ears straining for footsteps on the stairs. But no one comes. In the morning, you return to the chapel. The priest is already waiting. Was it done? He asks, his voice thick with something that might be suspicion. You nod. He's dead. The ledger's burned. He turns his clouded eyes toward the altar. You weren't alone. You don't answer. He leans forward slightly. There are games within games, my child. And sometimes your knife isn't yours, it's theirs. The moment you unsheath it, it's already part of their plan. You step closer, voice low. Whose plan? He smiles. The same people who pay us both. You realize then that you're not an assassin. Not really. You're a message, a tool, a threat wrapped in flesh. You were never supposed to understand the whole picture. Just enough to bleed where they tell you to bleed. Outside, the city is already hot. The market bustles. A baker yells about fresh loaves. A boy runs past with a stolen orange. A man is dragged into the street and beaten for debts he can't pay. No one stops it. You walk past it all, back into the stream of life, unnoticed. Somewhere, someone is already writing the next letter, and you're already walking toward it. Even if you don't know it yet. He walks unseen through the crowd, this man who killed in silence. To most, he is nothing a smear of sweat and ash, a whisper that smells like old leather. But within the twisting guts of the medieval city, men like him are everywhere. They move through the world like scars, invisible until touched. You don't see them in the scrolls. You rarely hear them in sermons, but you feel them like a cut that reopens the moment you forget it was ever there. To understand him, you must first understand the world that made him. 13th century Italy, Florence, Venice, Genoa, Athens were not cities in the way we know cities today. They were machines, stitched together by family, blood, corruption, and the paper-thin skin of religion. Every alley had a patron saint. Every house bore a banner, and every banner had enemies. It was a world where peace was a temporary embarrassment, and war was the default setting of human nature. Assassins did not rise from some secret brotherhood beneath a cathedral. They came from within the rot of the system itself, born in slums, trained by debt, sharpened by hunger. Most were not noble. They were tools, leased out by powerful men who pretended to abhor violence but secretly craved it like incense in a cathedral. Justice, in this society, was not about balance. It was a performance. A man could be absolved for murder if it was politically useful. A merchant might fund a monastery with coin soaked in blood. A bishop might bless a blade if it swung in favor of the right faction. The church, ever present, claimed neutrality but practiced preference. Popes played chess with lives. Sins were negotiable. Guilt was a currency. And yet, the people believed. They believed in heaven and hell, in relics and saints, in the bleeding statue in the chapel and the Virgin Mary weeping behind glass. They kissed the rings of bishops who drank wine from golden chalices bought with bribes. They prayed before going to war against their neighbours over grain taxes. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was survival. Belief didn't stop them from killing. It made the killing sacred. It framed the murder as a necessary evil, a sin wrapped in duty. Even the assassin believed in his way. Not in forgiveness, maybe, but in cause, in order, in the idea that what he did served something larger than himself. He'd heard sermons about wrath, about damnation, but he'd also heard priests whisper Latin blessings over men who paid well enough. A donation could shift the scale of heaven. The weight of a soul could be lightened by coin and confession, preferably both. And then there were the laws. Every city had its statutes, scrolls thick with Latin clauses, ordinances on theft, adultery, heresy, and blasphemy. But these were for show. Justice belonged to those who could afford it. You could buy your way out of almost anything, if not directly, then through blood. Vendetta was a legal strategy. Families kept lists of wrongs, like ledgers, debts, tallied in flesh. A man killed your brother. You killed his cousin, not randomly ceremonially. Some vendettas lasted decades, passed down like furniture. It wasn't chaos. It was order of a different kind. Everyone had a role. Women were vessels married for alliances, silenced for convenience. Daughters were dowries, sons were soldiers. Nobility was a contract of expectations. Nobles didn't work. They ruled, plotted, seduced, and died poetically, if they were lucky. Guilds enforced the structure. The butchers, the masons, the glassmakers all tightly controlled, fiercely protected. To be outside a guild was to be invisible. And assassins? They belonged to no guild. They had no crest, no protection. But sometimes they were tolerated, because when a rival had to disappear, guilds could suddenly pretend to be blind. And then, of course, there were the spies. Information was more valuable than steel. Assassins who knew how to listen were twice as valuable as those who only knew how to stab. Entire networks bloomed within taverns and bathhouses, brothels and bakeries. Secrets passed from mouth to ear to dagger. Blackmail was an art form. Rumor was a weapon. Lies were gospel, if repeated by someone powerful. The assassin was not an anomaly. He was a pressure valve, a scalpel used when swords were too loud. He served the machine by unmaking its problems. He trimmed the fat from the system. He was invisible, so that the city's illusion of civility could remain visible. And yet, even among the killers, there were rules. Never strike a priest, never kill a child, never draw steel in a chapel, not because of morality but optics. Violating those rules didn't bring damnation, it brought consequences. Assassins who crossed certain lines vanished sometimes beneath the city, where men screamed for days before silence claimed them. It was a game of limits. And the most dangerous part? No one ever knew if you were in control. The assassin walks the edge of that game. Not noble, not damned, not free. He is tolerated, needed, hated, forgotten sometimes in the same day. And yet, despite all the death, the deceit, the filth this world thrives. It births art and music, stonework that catches light like fire, poetry that survives centuries. Out of this blood-soaked soil grows beauty so profound it makes men weep. Because humans, even in their worst, never stop reaching for transcendence. And perhaps the assassin, in his own broken way, believes that too. Perhaps, when he slips into the dark, when he presses a blade to a man's throat and whispers final rites, no priest would dare utter to seize himself, not as an executioner, but as a gardener, pruning the rot, making room for something new. By the time the assassin disappears from view, the city itself barely notices. The bells still ring, the bakers still knead, the ledgers still fill with ink and numbers. The world does not stop for one death, because beneath the violence, beneath the rituals and vendettas and shadow deals, the city is a living machine made of sweat, mud, and relentless motion. To understand how it all endured, you must look past the assassins and lords, past the firelit chapels and whispering priests. You have to look at the docks, the fields, the forges, the trade stalls, the guild halls where men argue over standards of wool and grain as if debating theology. 13th century Italy was not unified. It was a fractured cluster of city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, one a tooth in a snarling mouth of commerce. These were not sleepy medieval hamlets. These were economic titans, fiercely competitive and often at war with each other. Their wealth flowed from trade, and that trade needed systems roads, contracts, trust, and the occasional knife in the dark. Florence, for example, was not just a centre of culture, it was a banking powerhouse. The gold florin, minted here, became the standard currency for much of Europe. That kind of economic dominance didn't come from poetry. It came from ledgers lines upon lines of debts, interest, exchange rates, dowries, and bribes. It came from a class of merchants so powerful they made kings nervous. Merchants were the true rulers. Nobles wore silk, but merchants owned it. Trade routes ran like arteries across land and sea, from Constantinople to Marseille, from Bruges to Cairo. Goods flowed in a tide of profit. Olive oil, wool, glass, spice, grain, alum, and saltal were weighed, taxed, stamped, and sold. Caravans trudged through the Alps. Ships crowded harbours like fish in a net. Entire neighbourhoods in port cities were organised by origin: Greek, Armenian, Jewish, Arab. Diversity wasn't just tolerated, it was profitable. And behind every polished merchant hall was the labour force that made it happen. Tanners, dyers, butchers, millers, smiths, builders, carters, labourers, who woke before dawn and scraped life from raw material. The tanner reeked of piss and wove softened hides using fermented urine and dog dung. The dyer stained his hands with crushed insects and rare minerals. The smith beat iron until his fingers curled and cracked. These men formed guilds, the medieval version of labour unions except far more powerful. Guilds regulated prices, quality, apprenticeships, even marriage eligibility. If you wanted to open a shop or sell your wares, you needed their blessing. They controlled the economic backbone of the city, and if you crossed them, you didn't just lose your job, you lost your place in society. Apprenticeship was brutal. A boy might begin at 7, sweeping floors and hauling tools for years before even touching the craft. Journeymen were barely paid. Masters controlled everything. But if you made itif, you became a full guild member. You had status. You had leverage. You were, in the eyes of the law, someone worth protecting. Outside the guilds, though, life was bleak. Day labourers stood in muddy squares, hoping to be picked up for work that paid in bread and bruises. Beggars swarmed churches, clutching wooden bowls and muttering half-remembered prayers. Women, unless widowed and wealthy, had little path to independence. Some ran taverns, most cooked, cleaned, and bore children until their wombs or lungs gave out. And in the cracks of this system lived the outcasts. Jews were confined to certain trades, money-lending, medicine, peddling, because Christian doctrine forbade usury or lending with interest. Of course, that didn't stop Christians from borrowing. It just meant someone else took the risk and the blame. When famine or plague struck, guess who got burned at the stake? Lepers, heretics, Roma, anyone who couldn't be slotted into the city's machine was treated as rot. They were hounded, exiled, sometimes quietly executed. The system didn't require everyone to be useful, just silent. And then there were the slaves. Yes, slavery in medieval Italy was real, less common than in the ancient world, but alive. Domestic slaves, often women or children from the eastern Mediterranean, served in wealthy homes. They weren't called slaves, they were servants or foreigners or debts in human form. But they couldn't leave, couldn't marry freely, couldn't own property. That's slavery, no matter how nice the villa. Labour made the city breathe, trade gave it rhythm, but taxes were the bloodletting that fed the elites. Everything was taxed: bread, wine, salt, windows. You paid a tax for using the road, then another for crossing the bridge, and yet another for bringing a cart to market. The government, usually a rotating council of wealthy families, used these funds for city walls, hired soldiers, public fountains, and bribery. Always bribery. Corruption wasn't hidden, it was expected. A man who wasn't corrupt was suspect. What was he hiding? Even war was part of the system. City-states hired mercenary companies condottieried by ambitious psychopaths who switched allegiances like shoes. Wars weren't fought to win. They were fought to delay, distract, and drain your enemy's bank. Lives were just numbers on parchment, and if you couldn't pay your soldiers, they turned on you. Pillage was a default clause in every contract. The assassin, in this economy, was small but essential. He wasn't part of a guild. He didn't pay taxes. He served no city, no family, no flag. But he was a tool used by those who did. He might be sent to silence a tax collector who skimmed too much, or a rival merchant whispering to foreign agents, or a guild master who questioned the wrong reform. No paper trail, no witnesses, no messy inquests, just a knife, a prayer, and a pile of ledgers that no longer balance. And when the deed was done, the system absorbed the loss like a bruise, tender but temporary, because that's the brilliance of the machine. It doesn't need to be just. It only needs to function. He grows older, not noticeably, not all at once, but the rooftops feel higher, the jumps hurt more, the bruises linger, the wine dulls less and burns more. He still works when asked, but the letters come slower now, the wax seals simpler, the names less important. Once, he killed a duke's cousin. Last week, it was a man who owed money to the wrong baker. The city is changing, the stakes are shrinking, the purpose less clear. And yet, the city still breathes. But it no longer roars. In the early decades of the 14th century, Florence begins to swell past its own borders. The wealth, once the engine, becomes the weight. The elite families, bloated with gold and secrets, now war more with ink than blade. Banks rise, then collapse. Alliances shift. Papal politics bleed into street brawls. The Medici are still decades from control, but the bones of that dynasty are already forming in the dark. The assassin walks through all of it, silent as always. But now, no one meets his eyes. The city remembers him less and less. He sees guards now who weren't born when he made his first kill. The priest who once whispered warnings is dead. The brothel is under new management. The boy, called Crow Clever, fast, laughing is gone. The new street kids don't know the old signals. They don't know him. The system is still here, but it's not the same machine. Because every machine decays, every perfect city cracks under the weight of its own rhythms. Roads crumble, bridges rot, guilds fracture from within. Once loyal families feud over trade routes and river tolls. Plague stalks the edges of maps like smoke before flame. It hasn't hit yet, but soon it will. The Black Death will eat this city alive in under a year. But that still whispers for now. What's louder is the bureaucracy. The city is paper now. Scrolls and signatures, ledgers and filings. Assassinations are less useful in a world where reputations can be murdered more effectively through lawsuits and forged confessions. Poison is replaced by policy. Knives by bribes. The old blood methods still exist, but they are no longer fashionable. They are amateur. A new kind of killer has emerged. The banker, the notary, the diplomat, and still, the assassin waits. But the letters stop. His cloak wears thin, his boots rot, his coin is stretched. He tries once to offer his services to a minor noble who laughs, shakes his head, and says, "We don't do that anymore. Not like that." He wants to argue, to say, "You still need me." But he doesn't, because he's not sure it's true. He begins to feel it in the marrow. The system that built him, used him, and paid him in blood and silence no longer requires him. The machine has upgraded. He is an obsolete cog, sitting in a dark room, listening for a bell that no longer rings. And so, slowly, he fades. No grand death, no final mission, no dramatic betrayal. He simply becomes invisible again, but this time not out of skill, out of irrelevance. He sleeps longer, drinks more, sharpens his dagger only out of habit. Sometimes he walks the alleys and thinks he sees someone watching him, but it's just shadows and guilt. He hasn't killed in months, maybe a year. The church bells ring. No one blesses his name. No one curses it either. His legacy is dust in the cracks between cobblestones. And yet, the city still breathes. It always does. It outlasts kings and murderers alike. It absorbs blood like rain. And it forgets deliberately, selectively, beautifully. But if you know where to look, if you walk through the old slums and lean against a crooked well at midnight, there are still stories, whispers. A man in a black hood who once scaled a tower with a knife in his teeth, who killed a traitor and vanished into the night, who burned secrets and never got caught. They tell these stories like fairy tales now, half true, romantic, cleaned of blood. They don't remember the smell of burnt wax, or the scream of a dying dog, or the way he knelt beside a woman he didn't trust and shared his escape route anyway. They remember the myth, and the myth is cleaner than the man ever was. But myths persist, and that's all he ever wanted. Not gratitude, not fame, just memory. Because for someone like him, being forgotten is the real death. The first thing they heard was silence. Not peace, not quiet. Silence. It began in the winter of 1258. Baghdad, jewel of the Islamic Golden Age, beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, woke one morning to find the horizon emptyrally so. Caravans had stopped arriving. No word from Mosul, no movement from the north, only crows. The Mongols were coming. You are a bookseller. That's how you survive in Baghdad, not because you love books, though you do, but because it is one of the few safe trades left in a world drowning in scholars, scribes, and suspicion. You rent a stall near the edge of the Nahr al-Kabir Canal, just downwind of the House of Wisdom, where the best minds in the world debate things like medicine, astronomy, and the existence of souls. And now, as the air goes still and merchants stop shouting, you realize that none of that will matter. You close your stall at midday, not because of prayer, but because the sun feels wrong. The light is too yellow. The birds have flown west, and the street dogs are silent. 2 days later, refugees pour into the city, gates bloody, barefoot, breathless. They bring no carts, no animals, no stories, just terror. The guards stop letting people in by sunset. The gates lock. The Caliph says it's precaution. But people are already lighting their homes with extra oil, preparing or pretending. They say the Mongols are demons, that they drink blood, defile mosques, nail scholars to walls with their own pens. That their leader, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, has promised to reduce Baghdad to ashes if the Caliph does not surrender. You don't believe all the stories, but you do believe one, that these invaders don't bluff. The Caliph al-Mustasim refuses to flee. He sits in his palace, peacocks pacing the marble courtyard, believing his spiritual authority will protect him, that Allah will not allow his city to fall, that the Mongols will falter before the gates of a city so learned, so holy, so beautiful. But beauty does not stop arrows, and prayers do not shatter siege towers. On January 29th, the Mongols arrive. They bring engineers from China, trebuchets the size of homes, siege platforms like skeletal cities on wheels. You watch them build for a week-silent, relentless. Their camp spreads like mould across the plain. They dam the Tigris, flood the fields, cut off supplies. They don't shout threats, they don't send ambassadors, they just prepare. On February 8th, they begin the bombardment. The walls, ancient and revered, do not scream when they fall, they crack. Stone shears like bread crust, and the moment there's a breach, the killing begins. You run, you hide, you watch neighbours drag their families into cellars, already packed with bodies. You hear children cry through 3 feet of brick. You smell oil burning on the river. The Mongols enter like surgeon-sufficient, clean, methodical. And then it gets worse. The House of Wisdom burns. Not by accident. Deliberately. Its library centuries of astronomy, philosophy, theology, medical treatises thrown into the Tigris, page by page. Witnesses say the river runs black with ink for days. The Mongols laugh as the water darkens, calling it the river of dead knowledge. They use the scrolls as bedding for horses. They wipe their swords with it. No one dares stop them. You hide for 3 days in the pit, beneath a collapsed bakery. When you emerge, your beard is full of soot, your lips cracked with thirst. The city no longer breathes, it groans. Bodies lie in the gutters, women stripped naked, elders decapitated, infants crushed under stone. The mosques are full of flies, the call to prayer is gone, only the screams remain. Estimates say 200,000 were killed. Others say 800,000. No one knows. No one can count that high when the hands that would write the numbers have been nailed to doors. The Caliph is captured. Hulagu Khan orders him brought to the palace. He refuses to touch him out of superstition. Mongols believe spilling royal blood on the ground angers the spirits, so instead they roll the Caliph into a carpet, and then they beat him to death with clubs. It is done quietly, like garbage disposal, and with that, 600 years of Abbasid rule ends. Just like that, Baghdad, once the center of the world, becomes a corpse, and the Mongols move on. They leave only ruins, ash, and broken fountains choked with corpses. You survive, somehow, and you rebuild your stall years later, just a wooden table now, no books, no buyers, just memory. Because the thing about apocalypse is this: it doesn't end the world, just your version of it. The survivors do not rebuild Baghdad, not really. They patch its bones, reopen its gates, sweep some of the blood from its streets. But the soul of the city, the thing that made it Baghdad, is gone. In the years following the siege of 1258, what emerges is not resurrection, but shell. A haunted body, staggering through history with its organs torn out. To understand the devastation, you have to grasp what Baghdad was before the fires. It wasn't just a city, it was the city. Built in the 8th century by the Abbasid caliphs as a circular, metropolis symmetrical, cosmological, idealisticit, was designed to mirror the perfection of the heavens. The very shape of it was meant to honor God. At its peak, it rivaled Constantinople and dwarfed anything in Christendom. Travelers from Europe wrote of markets that stretched for miles, of scholars debating in gardens, of lamps lit in every district, so bright that one could read poetry at night from rooftops. It was a place where a man could walk into the house of wisdom and read texts translated from Greek, Sanskrit, Farsi, Syriac, Chinese preserved. When other cultures had let them burn, medicine flourished. Mathematics bloomed. Al-Khwarizmi gave the world algebra here. Alhazen played with optics and light. Philosophers discussed Aristotle beside Quranic scholars. Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and Muslims lived mostly in precarious coexistence. It wasn't paradise, it was power made curious. And curiosity, in those rare moments of human history, can become civilization. And then, in less than a month, it vanished. After the Mongol siege, Baghdad became a ruin wrapped in memory. Its libraries? Gone. Its irrigation system centuries old smashed. Fields flooded. Canals poisoned with corpses. Trade routes collapsed overnight. Scholars either murdered or scattered, like crows fleeing a thunderclap. The Islamic Golden Age didn't end with Baghdad. It bled out there. The trauma reshaped the entire Muslim world. The Mongol horde, unstoppable and inhuman, became not just a military enemy, but a cosmic punishment, a divine reckoning. Some said Allah had abandoned them. Others said it was a test. Most didn't know what to say because there were no scholars left to guide them. You can hear it in the poetry written after. Before the siege, Baghdad's poets spoke of love, geometry, the alignment of stars. They wrote verses that mirrored the complexity of God's creation. After the siege, the poems changed, shorter, angrier, bitter. One survivor, a scholar whose name was lost in translation, wrote, "We studied the stars to predict our fate, but forgot to study men with blades." The loss wasn't just physical, it was epistemological. Entire disciplines, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, were gutted. The House of Wisdom had not just collected books, it had preserved languages, lost empires, ancient science. Some of that knowledge was never recovered. Not because we didn't try, but because we couldn't remember what was forgotten. Historians argue about numbers. Was it 200,000 dead? Was it 1,000,000? Did the Tigris really run black with ink and red with blood? Some say these are exaggerations. That memory inflated the loss to mythic scale. But those arguments miss the point. Because the people who survived believed it happened that way. And in history, belief is just as powerful as fact. The Mongols didn't just destroy a city, they humiliated a civilization. They showed that no matter how high the minarets, how vast the libraries, how ornate the theology violence could unmake it all in a month. That trauma reverberated for generations. And yet, Baghdad didn't vanish entirely. It limped forward. The Mongols, oddly enough, didn't stay conquerors forever. Some converted to Islam. Hulagu Khan himself helped rebuild parts of the city. But it was like stitching cloth over a stab wound. The organ underneath had already failed. Trade resumed, slowly. Farmers returned to poisoned land. Markets reopened with fewer stalls. A new generation grew up with stories told in whispers. They knew the shape of the old city only through the cracks in its foundations. They saw shadows of a time when scholars outnumbered soldiers. But no one dared rebuild a house of wisdom. The risk was too great. Instead, they built walls, forts, mosques with thicker doors, towers from which to see the next invader sooner. They still prayed, still studied, but the confidence was gone. The world no longer felt safe enough to chase the stars. 100 years after the fall, Baghdad was still called the City of Peace, but no one said it without irony. And even now, centuries later, the ruins beneath modern Baghdad hold layers not just of stone, but of silence. Ash that used to be algebra, bones that once debated the immortality of the soul, ink that once illuminated the cosmos. The siege of 1258 was not just a conquest. It was a cultural amputation, a cutting away of possibility, and the scar is still visible. If you know where to look, you wake before the call to prayer, not from a dream, but from a sound, the hush of sand being swept by distant feet. For a moment, you forget what week it is, what month. You forget the siege. Your hand goes first to the ink pot beside your cot. Still wet. That means you didn't cap it last night. Again. Your wife would scold you if she was still alive. She had been the careful one. You were the forgetful dreamer, the one who fell asleep with scrolls balanced on your chest, mouth open mid-quote, while the moon mocked you from the window. But the window is different today. There's no morning sun, only smoke. You rise, joints crackling, and wrap your robe tighter. The air is dry and wrong. You taste ash. From the courtyard below, you hear shouting, not the bark of a scholar correcting a student, but something frantic. There's running, clattering, wood splitting. You know the sound of a library being torn apart. You descend the stairs barefoot, dust slithers up your ankles. The house of wisdom Beit al-Hikma still stands. For now, Built over 4 centuries ago by Caliph al-Mamun, this place has been your world since you were 17. You copied your first manuscript here. You debated the age of the universe under these columns. You once kissed a woman in the astronomy chamber when the stars aligned in both the sky and your gut. Now you see torches. They move fast, carried by men who are not students, not guards, foreign armor, wide faces, bow-legged gaits, Mongols. You do not scream. You simply run toward the southern wing, the vault where the oldest scrolls are kept. You don't know why. Instinct, perhaps, or madness. You pass a scholar weeping over a shattered globe. Another is trying to carry 5 books at once, but drops them all. A boy, you've seen him in the theology. Wink kneels and prays as flames chew their way across the ceiling above him. You reach the vault door. It's half open. Inside, the smell is almost unbearable. Not fire, not blood. Ink, poured everywhere. Gall ink, iron-based, once precious, now dumped like oil. Pages float in shallow puddles of it. Ancient vellum, some of it over 600 years old, lies shredded and curling in the heat. And amid it all, a Mongol. He is defecating on a scroll of Galen's anatomy. He locks eyes with you, smiles, pulls the page forward and wipes. You cannot breathe. You retreat, staggering, not from fear, from grief. Outside, the dome has cracked. Its blue-tiled brilliance now fractured, raining glass shards onto screaming scribes. Smoke churns from the western quadrant. The astronomy tower has fallen. A wall collapses. A student is crushed. Another man tries to run, but is stopped by a Mongol spear. It goes in clean, under the ribs. He gurgles, his eyes fix on you. You turn and flee again, this time into the zoology chamber, your sanctuary. Inside, the scrolls are still intact. You open one. On the behavior of animals, translated from Greek into Arabic by Al-Jahiz, preserved for centuries. You run your fingers across the ink. You whisper, "I'm sorry." You roll the scroll and tuck it into your robe. You know you won't make it far, but maybe, just maybe, this page will. You take 2 more, a medical treatise on cataracts and a map of the Nile hand inked by an Egyptian scribe 200 years ago. You hear boots, grunting, the crack of whip against marble. You hide beneath the archivist's desk, cruel like a child. The room grows darker, smoke thickens, breathing becomes harder, and then you hear it. A splash, followed by another, then a dozen. They are throwing books into the Tigris. You crawl to the window, eyes watering, and you see it, scrolls, tomes, manuscripts floating, drifting, swirling into the river like autumn leaves. The ink bleeds from them, black tendrils unfurling in the current. A boy laughs as he skips a bound volume like a stone. A scholar is screaming in Persian. You want to join him, but you say nothing. You hold your scrolls tight, press them to your chest like children. When the wall gives way and the ceiling falls, you close your eyes and make a final plea. Not for your life, but that somewhere, someday, someone will remember what was lost. History rarely ends with fire. It continues twisted, scorched, but still breathing. After the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, the Islamic world did not die, but it shifted, morally, spiritually, politically. A fault line had opened, and what rose on either side of it no longer spoke the same language. For centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate had represented more than just government. It was divine glue. The Caliph, even if powerless in practice, embodied the spiritual unity of the Ummah global Muslim community. He was a symbol of order, of legitimacy, a thread connecting rulers from Andalusia to Bukhara. When the Mongols murdered Caliph al-Mustasim, stuffed in a carpet, bludgeoned until bone crumbled, they weren't just killing a man, they were killing an idea. And the shock reverberated like thunder across the Islamic world. First came political fragmentation. Without a unifying caliphate, regional powers surged. Egypt, under the newly risen Mamluk dynasty, stepped into the vacuum. Turkic emirates in Anatolia began carving out their own proto-states. The Delhi Sultanate flexed eastward. Islam no longer had a center. It had centers, competing ones. This decentralization fractured theology. Religious scholars, once clustered around Baghdad, now scattered. Some ended up in Cairo, others in Damascus, still others in Fez or Tabriz. Without the House of Wisdom, each city began developing its own madhab, or school of thought. Jurisprudence diversified. Consensus eroded. Interpretation became territorial. And in this vacuum, a subtle shift occurred. Orthodoxy tightened its grip. Where Baghdad had once housed rationalist thinkers like Al-Kindi and Avicenna, who questioned Aristotelian logic, who balanced revelation with raison, now there was retreat. The trauma of the Mongols had broken faith in curiosity. Theologians asked, did we invite this catastrophe by straying too far from God's path? The result was a pendulum swing toward conservatism. The Mutazilitates, those rationalist scholars who argued for free will and metaphorical readings of the Quran, were discredited. Asherism, more deterministic and anti-philosophical, rose in prominence. The works of science were no longer embraced as part of God's majesty, but viewed with suspicion, even hostility. This is not to say learning stopped. In Egypt, the Mamluks built schools and libraries. The Ottomans, rising a century later, would produce architectural and artistic brilliance, but the tone had changed. Inquiry was no longer a celebration. It was a risk. Even the Mongols, oddly enough, underwent transformation. By the end of the 13th century, many Mongol rulers in the Islamic world had converted to Islam. Hulagu's own descendants in Persia embraced Persianate court culture and Islamic governance. They built mosques, commissioned Qurans, hired Muslim viziers. It was a strange irony. The destroyers of Baghdad became defenders of Islam, just a different version. But even in conversion, the damage lingered. Trust was broken. The idea that civilization could protect you, that your knowledge, your faith, your books, your city walls could shield you from annihilation, was shattered. Muslims across the empire no longer debated how to improve the world. They debated how to survive it. You can see this reflected in literature. Where once poetry spoke of star charts and metaphysical joy, now it turned inward toward mysticism, toward grief. Sufism spread, not just as a spiritual path, but as an escape. The whirling dervishes, the ascetics in desert caves, the ecstatic visions of divine love, these weren't indulgences, they were responses. Trauma channeled into transcendence. Meanwhile, Europeans, the learner at Islam's feet, began its slow ascent. The Mongols had disrupted not just Baghdad, but the trade routes that connected east and west. As those routes shifted, power flowed westward. The knowledge preserved in the Abbasid world, its translations of Plato, Galen, Euclid filtered into Europe through Spain and Sicily. What Baghdad lost, Florence would eventually find, and the Islamic world knew it. In letters written by Moroccan scholar Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century, there's a melancholy awareness that the center of gravity is shifting, that Islamic civilization is no longer the flame, but the wick burning out. And yet, not all was lost. New centres arose: Cairo, Samarkand, Isfahan. The Ottomans would build mosques that reached the sky. The Safavids would paint miniatures with colours stolen from dreams. The Mughals would give the world the Taj Mahal. Islam was not broken, but it had been wounded, and it remembered. Baghdad never truly recovered. It remained a city of importance, but not primacy. Its river still flowed, but without the ink. Its scholars returned, but never in the same numbers. The House of Wisdom was never rebuilt. How could it be? You cannot regrow a forest with the memory of trees. And so, the world moved on. The Mongols faded, empires rose, maps changed. But beneath the soil of every library, in the foundations of every mosque, built after 1258, there is a ghost. The ghost of what Baghdad could have been. And sometimes, when a scholar opens a book copied in the 11th century, the script dancing like flame across the page, she touches a history that barely survived annihilation. And in that moment, Baghdad breathes again. Civilizations do not die the way people do. They don't vanish with a final breath, a clean cut, or a last word. They linger. They rot in pieces. They dissolve into other civilizations, other systems, other dreams. The death of Baghdad in 1258 was not a funeral, it was a seeding, a violent scattering of knowledge, grief, and memory across the bones of an empire that refused to die. After the Mongols rode off and the smoke thinned, what was left behind was not just a city in ruin, but a question. How do you rebuild when what was destroyed was not just walls or books, but belief? Belief in order, in reason, in beauty as armor, in knowledge as shield. Baghdad had once believed it could think its way to peace. Its scholars were optimists. They believed God had designed the world with logic, with elegance, that through math, medicine, astronomy, even music, you could come closer to divine understanding. The library wasn't just a building. It was a stairway to the infinite. The Mongols shattered that stairway, and the survivors stood at the rubble, unsure whether to rebuild or retreat. What followed wasn't surrender, it was adaptation. Some turned inward into mysticism, Sufi poetry, ecstatic visions of divine union. Others turned outward into law, codification, systems of control to make sure chaos never returned. Some ran west, some ran east, some stopped believing in books altogether. But the ideas, they didn't die. They migrated. A single manuscript rescued from the flames might surface decades later in Cairo. A medical text once shelved in Baghdad would be copied in Cordoba, then smuggled to Toulouse, then dissected by scholars in Prague. The ink kept moving. Ideas are hard to kill, even when soaked in blood. And that's what makes the fall of Baghdad more than just a cautionary tale. It's a blueprint, because every civilization faces collapses low or sudden. Rome, Constantinople, Carthage, Angkor, each believed it was eternal. Each left behind ruins that whispered otherwise. But what defines a people is not whether they fall, it's how they remember. Baghdad remembered through silence first, then through storytelling. Parents told their children what the Tigris had once looked, like blue, not black. Teachers described the House of Wisdom with reverence, as if it were a temple. Poets spoke of scholars turned to ash. Memory became mythology, and mythology, in time, became resistance, because to remember is to defy erasure. And over time, that memory found new life. Centuries later, in far-off Istanbul, when architects laid out the Blue Mosque, They studied proportions rooted in the math of Baghdad's astronomers. When the Mughals in India designed water systems, they used canal strategies first implemented near the Tigris. When European thinkers lit the early fuse of the Enlightenment, they read translations copied from Arabic manuscripts once housed in Baghdad. And when a student today opens a textbook and finds the word algebra, they're touching a ghost. The Mongols won the battle, but they didn't win the war, because ideas, once seeded, grow wild, even in ashes. We now leave Baghdad behind. Its bones rest beneath modern soil. Its stories echo in classrooms, libraries, and mosques around the world. The Tigris still flows, though no longer black with ink. And in that river's quiet current, the city's soul continues to move, not as empire, but as memory. She stepped into the street and began to dance. No music, no audience, no rhythm even. Just frantic, trembling movement, arms twitching, feet jerking, dress soaked with sweat before the first bell rang. Her name was Frau Trophia, a wife, a nobody. One of many in Strasbourg, summer of 1518 back, when the city still squatted under the thumb of the Holy Roman Empire, and everything that couldn't be explained was called either divine or demonic. At first, the neighbours thought she was possessed. She danced through the morning. She danced through the heat. She danced past the baker, who crossed himself. She danced until her ankles swelled and her shoes shredded and her knees turned red with blood. And she did not stop. By nightfall, the clergy were watching from a safe distance. Some called for exorcism. Others whispered about heated blood. A few offered her water. She didn't drink it, didn't blink, didn't even respond. Just kept spinning, staggering, collapsing, rising again. And by day 3, she wasn't alone. 6 more people joined her. Then 20. Then 34. Within a week, they had cleared the livestock from the streets because the dancers kept slamming into pigs and oxen. Children were warned not to go near. Priests started blessing the cobblestones. The town physician blamed hot, humorous-imbalanced bodily fluids, heated by the summer sun. He prescribed movement, more dancing. He believed it was the cure. So the city built a stage. Yes, a stage. They brought in professional musicians, hired pipers and drummers, encouraged the afflicted to dance it out. The city paid for musicians to stand in the blistering heat and play while men and women spun themselves into unconsciousness. Some reports say that after 10 days, the death toll began. Cardiac failure, heat stroke, exhaustion, dehydration, broken bones. Some danced until their legs simply stopped working. Others collapsed mid-spin, foaming at the mouth. They were buried. More replaced them. It wasn't hysteria, the doctors insisted. It was illness, or divine punishment, maybe even planetary alignment, something about Mars and Venus colliding in Cancer. It sounded scientific enough to be respectable and vague enough to avoid blame. Meanwhile, the bishop declared the plague was a warning from heaven sent by Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics. The cure, not medicine, not rest, pilgrimage. People were instructed to march to the shrine of Vitus and beg forgiveness, but many couldn't walk because they were still dancing. You have to understand what this looked like. Mothers spinning in circles while their babies cried on the ground. Tailors twitching violently as needles spilled from their aprons. Priests trying to shout prayers over the sound of clapping, stomping, and screams. And always the music. Relentless. The pipers didn't stop because they were being paid. The drummers didn't stop because the city said this was the cure. And the dancers didn't stop because they couldn't. Some smiled, giggled, twitched like puppets. Others wept openly, mouthing silent apologies to God, to family, to no one. Some clawed at their own faces, some stripped naked. Some urinated where they stood. All of them danced, and no one knew why. Theories would come later. Ergot poisoning mouldy rye grain contaminated with alkaloids that mimicked LSD. Maybe. But ergot usually causes convulsions and hallucinations, not choreographed terror. Mass hysteria? Psychogenic illness? Possibly. But that doesn't explain the stamina, or the deaths, or the fact that the plague spread across multiple regions for months. Yes, months? This wasn't just Strasbourg. Similar outbreaks had occurred in the decades prior: Aachen, Cologne, Metz. Always the same signs: uncontrollable dancing, collapse, death, disappearance. But Strasbourg was the worst. At its peak, reports suggest 400 people were infected. Imagine that. 400 bodies writhing in the streets, skin flayed by cobblestones, tongues swollen from heat, feet cracked open and still moving. By late August, the city finally reversed course. The council declared the plague to be demonic, not physical. They banned music. They ordered the dancers herded into carts and dragged to mountaintop shrines. Some were chained to altars, others whipped as penance. A few were locked in dark, silent rooms to starve the rhythm from their blood. And then it stopped, just like that. No cure, no explanation. The dancers woke as if from fevered sleep, aching and broken, unsure what had happened. Many remembered nothing. Some never walked again. Others left town. A few, it's said, became quiet and religious. The kind who speak in whispers and never hum. No one ever explained it. Not then, not now. And to this day, in medical textbooks and folklore archives, it remains what it always was: a rupture, a madness, a truth we still can't name. Because deep down, we know you don't dance for no reason. Not through blood, not through pain, not through death. Unless something is screaming in your body, and dancing is the only way it knows how to get out. To understand why they danced, you must first understand what they were trying not to feel. Strasbourg in 1518 was a pressure cooker, a city surrounded by fertile fields but rotting inside. The Holy Roman Empire was splintered, clumsy, and violently devout. Religion ruled everything, and ruled in terror. Saints bled from statues, relics whispered doom. Sin hovered like fog over every birth, every cough, every craving. And beneath all that, famine. The Rhine had flooded 3 times in the past decade. Crops failed, grain spoiled, livestock drowned, prices soared. Men who once fed entire families now stole turnips to stay alive. Women sold themselves under stone bridges for coins, so worthless they didn't clink anymore. The people were starving, and worse, ashamed of starving. Because in this world, hunger wasn't just a misfortune, it was moral failure. God punished the wicked, and if your child died, that was your sin being fed back to you. Now add plague. Bubonic outbreaks swept through Strasbourg twice in the previous generation. Even in 1518, you could still find door lintels scratched with white chalk, signalling homes where the sick had died and the air still felt wrong. There were no vaccines, no understanding. Only the certainty that when you bled from the eyes, it was because heaven had decided you were next. Add to that political instability. The city council was a brutal hybrid of clerics and merchants. Bureaucrats with one hand on scripture and the other on your wallet. Taxes were rising. Regulations strangled the poor. Every month brought a new decree. Don't eat this, don't wear that, don't dance on holy days, don't speak Latin if you're not a priest. It was a city slowly choking itself, convinced that suffering was the price of salvation. So what happens when an entire society lives in fear but is told to be silent? What happens when grief is outlawed? When anger must be confessed away? When despair has no name, only punishment? The body steps in. The dancing plague wasn't random. It was ritual gone feral. In the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, dance was often a religious act. Processions, festivals, saints' days. Whole towns would whirl in circles, chanting praises, stamping feet, waving holy relics. The belief was simple. Movement could please the divine. Rhythmic bodies could reach heaven where words could not. But by 1518, joy was a luxury. Dancing had been regulated, festivals banned, music censored. The plague of motion in Strasbourg may have begun with Frau Trophea, but it wasn't just her twitching, it was centuries of collective anxiety erupting through her muscles. Modern psychologists call it mass psychogenic illness. When groups under extreme stress begin to experience real symptom tremors, blindness, paralysis, without a physical cause, it spreads not through germs, but through terror. But even that doesn't explain everything. Ergot poisoning is another theory. A fungus that grows on damp rye, producing chemicals similar to LSD. It could cause hallucinations, convulsions, twitching, madness. But again, it's an imperfect answer. Why would only some people be affected? Why did the symptoms last weeks? Why did they dance instead of scream? The answer may be simpler than science allows. Because dancing was the only acceptable form of collapse. You couldn't rage. You couldn't wail. You couldn't curse God in public. But you could move, uncontrollably, against your will, in a way that was both sin and spectacle. And once the first body broke the dam, others followed. Not from mimicry, from recognition. It's like a yawn, or a sob, or a scream you've been holding for too long, suddenly escaping because someone else let theirs out first. The city's response only made it worse. By building stages and hiring musicians, they gave it form, shape, legitimacy. It became a dance because they called it one, because that's the only thing they could understand. But underneath, it was grief, generational, collective, and wet with guilt. They danced because their crops had failed. They danced because their babies had died. They danced because their prayers had not been answered. They danced because their minds were breaking and their mouths were sewn shut with theology. They danced because movement was the only freedom left. And then they were punished for it. The city declared the dancers wicked, chained them, beat them, dragged them to mountaintop shrines where they were forced to kneel on stone and beg forgiveness for the very symptoms of their suffering. There are no survivors' journals, no memoirs. The dancers didn't leave letters, but you can trace their absence. No one in Strasbourg mentioned the plague again in public records for years. It was as if the whole city agreed to forget. And isn't that how trauma always works? We hide the evidence, bury the witnesses, pretend the convulsions were just bad luck or bad grain or someone else's problem. But if you walk the old quarter of Strasbourg today past the cathedral's towering spire, through the crooked alleys where the cobblestones haven't changed, you'll hear it. Not in sound, but in the strange stillness, in the fact that no one dances there anymore. You feel it before you see it. A shiver knot, quite cold, not quite fear that starts in the soles of your feet and climbs up your calves, like a rope pulling you towards something you didn't agree to. You're at the baker's stall, buying onions. Or you were. You can't remember anymore, because your foot just moved on its own. A twitch. Small. But not yours. You laugh it off, shift weight, blame a cramp. But it happens again. Right leg now, knee pops. The baker is talking, handing you the sack, but his mouth moves like it's underwater. You nod and walk away. Except you don't walk. You jolt. You stumble, but not downward. Forward, right into the middle of the street, right into sunlight, sweat, and the familiar scent of wet wood and dying fruit. Your hands are fluttering now. Your shoulders bounce like you're trying to shake something off, but it's in you, not on you. Someone shouts your name. You turn to answer, but your hips twist, your knees follow. Your jaw locks and your arms flail, and now the world is tilting sideways and still your legs move. It's not dancing, not like you remember from festivals or wedding halls. This is different. This is not joy. It's extraction. Like your body is digging something out of itself, like grief or sin or centuries of bad prayers that never found a sky willing to listen. And now, here, in front of God and half the city, it's all coming out of you through motion. Your neighbor Heinrich is clapping. You hear it, like thunder, but not for celebration. Encouragement. He thinks you're dancing on purpose. He thinks it's funny. He doesn't know you've lost control. The muscles in your face are twitching now. You try to scream, but your tongue forgets the shape of words. Your eyes roll back just a little, and your left hand strikes your chest so hard it leaves a bruise. But the rhythm continues, like your bones are puppets, and someone is plucking tendons like harpstrings. You hear music. It's not real, but it is. It's inside you, faint pipes, a drumbeat you can't find the source of. Your heart pounds in time, your breath too. You inhale in threes, exhale in fours. And your feet won't stop, not even when you slam into a wall, or knock over a woman with a basket of pears, or when the priest grabs your arm and whispers Latin over your head. Your legs don't listen to priests. They keep moving. You collapse after 4 hours. Your chest is full of bees, stinging from the inside. The sky spins. Someone's fanning you with their hands. They pour water on your face. You choke on it. You try to sit up. Your legs are already dancing again. You beg your own body to stop. It doesn't. By nightfall, you've been joined. A woman twirls in place near the well, her hair stuck to her cheeks with sweat. Her feet are bare, bleeding. A boy, maybe 12, slaps his thighs in rhythm, eyes wide with something between panic and awe. A man stomps like he's crushing grapes, but there are no grapes, only cobblestone, only bone, only skin. The council sends musicians. They think you need encouragement. They bring a fiddle, a pipe, a lyre, and the sound fills the street like perfume, and your body drinks it. You dance into the night, into the moonlight, into the ache of marrow. You vomit at one point right into the gutter. You lose control of your bladder, your vision, your name. You forget your mother's face, your wife's voice, your own profession. But the beat, you never forget the beat. At one point, you hear a voice, your own voice, muttering something like a prayer. But it isn't to God. It's to the movement, as if stillness were the sin. And this is your penance. You don't sleep. You don't eat. You don't remember sitting down, because you never do. You only collapse. And even then, your fingers keep twitching. Your knees spasm. Your eyelids flutter in time. You dream of dancers in firelight, 100 of them, 1,000, some with no skin, some with animal heads, all of them moving together, perfectly in sync, smiling, bleeding, melting. When you wake, you're still on your feet. It's been 3 days. Your mouth is cracked open. Your lips are peeling. A priest has tied bells to your wrists to keep track of your movement in the night. The sound is soft, beautiful almost, like you're part of a procession. Except there is no holy day. Only you, and the rhythm, and the endless, merciless demand. Move, move, move. The bells are silent now. No more feet scraping stone. No more limbs flailing like torn flags in a storm. The musicians are gone. The dancers, those who lived, are sleeping in dark rooms with their wrists bound in linen, their legs wrapped in salves made of ash and wine. Some will never walk again. A few no longer speak. Strasbourg is quiet, but it's not healed, because something broke that summer, and no one ever fixed it. The official records taper off around late August. The city council noted the cessation of the dancing affliction and turned its attention back to taxation disputes, grain prices, and minor heresies. The priests held a mass to cleanse the town. The physicians argued about bile and blood, and the pipers packed their instruments and left. No one ever apologized. No one ever explained. No one ever said, "We should have listened sooner." And so, like all ungrieved horrors, the dancing plague sank into folklore. Children grew up hearing whispers of it, that if you danced too much, the devil would grab your ankles and spin you into madness, that Saint Vitus was still watching, that some people danced themselves into the earth and were never found, that somewhere under the old market square the bones of Frau Trophia still tap in the soil every midsummer's eve. It became a warning. Don't disobey. Don't show your grief. Don't move unless told. But of course, that's not what it was. The dancing plague wasn't sin. It was signal. A signal that the system was failing, that people had carried too much for too long, that bodies will eventually scream the things mouths are too afraid to say. It was a rupture not in skin, but in psyche. And the only language it spoke was rhythm. You see echoes of it today. Not in dancers collapsing in cobbled streets, but in modern anxieties that creep like mould behind the eyes, in mass panic, in illness with no pathogen, in hands that tremble for reasons no blood test can name. We are not so different from them. We still live in systems that ask us to be still, to be quiet, to pray instead of scream, to swallow suffering because others have it worse, to nod when we want to fall to the ground and claw at the dirt. But grief, when ignored, becomes movement. Anger, when silenced, becomes twitch. And fear sustained fear has a rhythm of its own. In this way, the dancing plague has never left. It lives in the tension between body and expectation, in the moment before the outburst, in the strain behind the smile. It lives wherever people are told to suffer silently. And history does not remember it kindly. The official story still circles ergot, or hysteria, or superstition. But those are labels, not understanding. The real story is harder to swallow, because it forces us to ask, what if the dancers weren't mad? What if they were prophets? What if their bodies simply told the truth too early? A truth no one else wanted to hear. That beneath every rigid, orderly civilization is a pulse. And if you ignore it long enough, it will find its beat again. Cambyses II was a man who believed in conquering the gods. By the time he stood on the edge of the Egyptian desert in 525 BCE, he had already crushed the pharaoh's army, looted temples, and humiliated priests. He was the son of Cyrus, the great founder of the Achaemenid Empire. Like his father, he believed that no land should remain outside Persian hands. But, unlike his father, Cambyses didn't conquer to unify. He conquered to dominate. And that is how 50,000 men disappeared. The story begins in Thebes, not the Greek one, the Egyptian one. After defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III, Cambyses heard rumors of a holy oracle far to the west, the temple of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, deep in the Libyan desert. Its priests were said to speak to gods, to read futures in the wind. Cambyses, suspicious and vengeful, declared he would destroy them. He summoned an army. Herodotus, writing a century later, would say it was 50,000 strong, infantry, cavalry, pack animals, enough supplies for weeks. They marched west from Thebes into the dunes, toward the Siwa Oasis strip of green, surrounded by endless beige death. They were never seen again. Not a single man, not a single weapon, no bodies, no bones, no signal fire, nothing. Herodotus reports only this, that a great sandstorm came, that it swallowed the army whole, that the desert shifted and groaned and erased them, and that was the end. For centuries, this was treated like myth, a parable, a warning about arrogance. Cambyses, the blasphemer, sent to his death by divine wind, poetic, simple, convenient. But deserts don't preserve poetry. They preserve secrets. And in the 20th century, rumors began to stir again. Fragments surfaced. A bronze dagger found near Dakhla Oasis. A cache of Persian arrowheads buried under gravel. A torn sandal, strap identical in style to those worn by soldiers in Darius's tomb carvings. Still no army. Still no proof. But the whispers grew. In 2009, a pair of Italian researchers, Alfredo and Angelo Castiglione, announced they had found it, or part of it. They presented footage of skeletal remains, Persian-style gear, a lost encampment, half swallowed by sand. The location, the western edge of the Great Sand Sea. A place where dunes move like waves, where compasses fail, where satellite images blur into meaninglessness. The academic world was skeptical. No peer-reviewed paper, no definitive carbon dating, but something was there. Something old. Something buried. The Sahara does not give up secrets easily. You have to understand the scale of it. 3.5 million square miles of punishing, shifting terrain. A place where a single gust can bury a man in seconds, where footprints vanish in minutes. Where water, if it exists, is deeper than any spade can reach. The army may still be out there, crushed, desiccated, perfectly preserved beneath tons of sand. Or maybe they never made it that far. Some historians suggest internal revolt, that the army turned on itself, that commanders splintered, that Cambyses sent a force already doomed under-equipped, misled by false guides, misinformed about the distance, that they starved, died of thirst, were picked off by Berber raiders, and never reported. Others say the sandstorm was real, that a Kamsina violent wind that can reach 50 miles per hour hit them mid-March, that sand filled lungs, eyes, ears that men dropped mid-step, buried before they fell. That tents were shredded, camels panicked, maps lost. That 50,000 became zero in a single day. Or perhaps it wasn't nature. Perhaps it was intentional. Egyptian priests, after all, had power. Not just over minds, but over roots. Perhaps they fed Cambyses false coordinates, sent him chasing a ghost oasis, lured him into a place that never existed. A divine trap, revenge by misdirection. History, after all, isn't written only in stone. It's written in sand, which means it can be rewritten, even erased. Cambyses himself didn't live much longer. He died on his return from Egypt wounded by his own blade, or assassinated, or driven mad, depending on which version you read. Some say he never recovered from the shame of the lost army. Others say he never believed it was lost. That even as he lay dying, he expected them to reappear sunburned but alive, dragging priests behind them in chains. But they never came. And to this day, in the Libyan desert, beneath dunes that stretch taller than buildings, their bones may still rest. Thousands of spears, thousands of mouths, thousands of steps that ended not in battle, but in silence. There is a kind of stillness that only comes after too many stories. Not silence. Stillness. The kind that settles in your bones once you've heard enough suffering to stop trying to understand it and start simply sitting with it. You've crossed centuries tonight. You've slit a man's throat in a medieval alley and climbed rooftops slick with rain. You've walked through the ruins of Baghdad with your clothes soaked in ink and the stench of burning knowledge in your nose. You've collapsed in the street, twitching to the rhythm of madness, your hands no longer your own. And now, you stand in the desert, surrounded by nothing but wind and ghosts, 50,000 voices buried so deep, even time forgot them. Different places, different eras, different endings. But look closer, and they start to rhyme. In each story, a system collapses. In each story, someone disappears. In each story, people survive by becoming something else. That's history, not names on scrolls, not the clean lines of textbooks or the marble certainty of statues. History is people coping, usually badly, trying to make meaning out of chaos, trying to build something permanent in a world made of fire and flood and famine and sand. And sometimes the building fails. But the trying, that's what lingers. The assassin, hunched over his dagger, did not write laws or lead armies, but he helped shape a city too proud to admit it. Baghdad's scribes didn't choose to become martyrs for knowledge. They just stayed at their desks when others fled. The dancers didn't understand what was breaking inside them, but their bodies refused to lie. And Cambyses' army? They followed orders into a storm they didn't cause and paid for someone else's arrogance with their lives. These are not heroes. They're us. At our worst, at our most confused, at our most human. And in a way, that's what makes them sacred. Because to be human is to live inside a contradiction, to build cathedrals from bones, to preserve philosophy by accident, to twitch until someone notices, to die walking into the desert for a war that doesn't matter, and still, somehow, to try again. We keep going. We pass the scroll, hide the dagger, tell the tale, sing the song, even after the dancers are gone. That's our legacy. Not triumph, not victory, not even survival. Memory. The assassin's name is lost, but someone, somewhere, still wears a hood and watches from the shadows. Baghdad fell, but its knowledge bled into every corner of the world. The dancers were punished, but the rhythm remained subtle, pulsing, waiting. Cambyses' army vanished, but every expedition since walks in their shadow, mapping what they could not. So what now? You're still here. Maybe in bed, maybe on a couch, maybe in the middle of the night, heart heavy with things you can't name. That's okay. Because sleep is not escape, it's preservation. Your body, like theirs, needs rest, needs stillness, needs space to process everything it's seen, even if that everything happened centuries ago. So close your eyes if they're not already closed. Let the dust settle. Let the city grow quiet. Let the music fade. Let the sand cover the bones. And let your own body soften into the rhythm of breath, the rhythm of heartbeat, the ancient rhythm that all these stories echo in some form or another. Because no matter what came before, no matter what was lost, no matter what remains buried, you're still here. And that's enough. Good night.